This is Kate at the Library of Whispers. Now, today I wanted to read this article for you. It caught my attention. It's in the BBC History magazine and it's titled, "Was Victorian Life Really So Grim?" Now it was written by Rosalind Crone and she reveals surprising truths about the experiences of the urban poor in 19th century Britain. And I particularly like this illustration on this side. This is an illustration by Gustave Doré. It's a famous engraving produced to illustrate the 1872 book London, A Pilgrimage, which I actually have. At least I have a copy of it anyway. Okay, so let's begin. The most familiar images of Victorian life are bleak indeed. Impoverished children working long hours in factories and mines, blankets of smog suspended above overcrowded cities, frightening workhouses run by cruel governors, violent criminals lurking in the shadows. In black and white photos of the period, people, both high and low-born, are invariably unsmiling. A miserable bunch, surely. There is some truth in this portrayal. The twin processes of industrialisation and urbanisation did force a drop in living standards for some, and the turbulent decade after Queen Victoria came to the throne became known as the Hungry Forties. These years were punctuated by economic depression, leading to social unrest, popular protests, and growing fears of revolution. Such impressions can be explained by the collision of three unique processes. The first, combining industrialisation and urbanisation, had acutely visual effects. Just as important was the expansion of print culture, which provided a vehicle for such images, as well as a growing and captivated audience. The third ingredient, equally crucial, was the emergence of a reforming spirit among the social elite from the 1830s onwards. Grave images of deprivation were circulated precisely because reformers, such as Dickens substantially. The mention of work in the Victorian period rarely fails to conjure up an image of an imposing factory or a bleak mine run by a merciless employer, in which employees, including small children, are forced to work long hours, often in poor light, using dangerous machinery. It is a picture created by novels such as Dickens' Hard Times, by government inquiries such as Ashley's Mines Commission of 1842, which exposed brutal physical and moral conditions, and by scandals about real factories throughout the century. But is it accurate? Not entirely. Industrialisation in the early 19th century did drive down wages and lead to an increase in the employment of women and children, especially those of a very young age in the manufacturing sector. Work in factories and mines certainly could be dangerous. In 1879, one MP who had visited a Bradford textile factory in the late 1830s described the 80 crippled and deformed children gathered for his inspection in the courtyard. No power of language could describe the varieties, and I may say the cruelties, in these degradations of the human form. They stood or squatted before me in all the shapes of the letters of the alphabet. However, from the 1830s onwards, legislation was introduced to restrict child and, in some cases, female labour, to improve conditions and to regulate working hours. Reforms were limited, but often by the realities of working class life. Take child labour, for example. While it offends our 21st century sensibilities, it was not necessarily socially detrimental. After all, the wages that children brought in could raise the standard of living for the entire family. The alternative, schooling, cost money and rarely bettered a child's future prospects. What's more, working in a factory could be preferable to other types of paid work. Days were controlled by the clock, but they were not necessarily longer than those of agricultural labourers. Clocking in and out, combined with the physical separation of work and home, could be more attractive than the endless days of domestic servants, another expanding industry. For every merciless master, there existed at least one paternalistic employer who cared about his workers. Some even created model villages near workplaces for families to live in some comfort, one of the most famous being the Cadbury's Bourneville establishment near Birmingham. Not only did some workers enjoy protection for traditional holidays, raucous St. Monday festivities continued as late as the 1870s in the West Midlands, but time for leisure increased. The working day was limited to 10 hours, and the Saturday half-day was introduced. Many employers organised trips for their workforces to the seaside. Even employees without these privileges were increasingly able to enjoy an expanding world of leisure, as workers' real wages increased from the middle of the century. At the same time, industrial unrest and popular narratives of factory accidents subsided, because the majority of working people became more comfortable with new patterns of work and industrial capitalism. assistance. Local relieving officers were tasked to send those in need to the workhouse, where families were split up. Those who could work were pressed into hard labour, and those who couldn't were cared for at the minimum standard. All were subjected to a harsh disciplinary regime. Some workhouses were abhorrent institutions. Local penal authorities were convinced that paupers deliberately tore their uniforms or smashed windows in order to be sent to prison, where both accommodation and food were better. The workhouse also held a special attraction to journalists eager for explosive copy. In 1866, James Greenwood disguised himself as a vagrant to spend a night in the male casual ward of the Lambeth workhouse. After being registered, he was forced to bathe in a liquid so disgustingly like weak mutton broth, and allocated a shirt and rug, then entered the ward to find 30 men and boys stretched upon shallow pallets, which put only 6 inches of comfortable hay between them and the stony floor. These beds were placed close together. In not a few cases, 2 gentlemen had clumped beds and rugs and slept together. But how helpful are such portraits in understanding the experience of poverty in Victorian Britain? They certainly have their limits. Written between 1837 and 1839, Oliver Twist could at best describe conditions only in pre-Victorian poorhouses, and the new Poor Law was in practice not nearly as harsh as its promise. Probably why campaigns against it died away fairly quickly. It's also worth acknowledging that workhouses functioned as providers of services, ranging from education to healthcare, particularly from the mid-1860s onwards, when improvements in provision were made. What's more, poverty was not a permanent state, but often a condition that working people, or even lower middle class people, could slip into and out of, depending on circumstances. And the poor had multiple resources upon which to draw. First was charity, which many socially conscious and religiously motivated elites were only too eager to supply. And the poor were not docile recipients of this charity. They knew just how to play the role required to secure funds, combining a display of respectability with evidence of poverty. Secondary survival strategies ranged from gleaning, gathering leftover grain after harvest, keeping livestock, co-residence and pawning, to less legitimate activities, poaching, petty crime, prostitution and fraud. The poor routinely pawned their Sunday clothes early in the week to put food on the table, and redeemed them on Saturdays after wages had been collected. A London pawn shop assistant described the merriment of the trade. On Saturday evening, some was eating fish and chips, some was eating tangerines, some had peas pudding and faggots. Called blimey, it was like Mother Kelly's doorstep in there. 3. The War on Dirt. Now, to show you this image, this is Jacob's Island, a notorious slum rookery in South London, portrayed around 1810. How the Victorians combated the blight of the urban slum. Urbanisation and industrialisation worsened living conditions for town dwellers. New industries pumped pollutants into the air and water. Expanding populations increased pressure on existing sewerage. Overcrowded English corpses, as described by Thomas Mons in 1842. I saw them bring up intestines in a bucket and put them out on the earth, and bones were thrown up, which were put in a barrow and wheeled away. Improvements came quickly. From the 1840s, new drain systems and other ambitious projects started to remove waste and clean up water supplies. Scavengers removed filth from the streets. New laws imposed regulations on construction of dwellings to combat the growth of slums. Some towns built public conveniences. By 1875, Glasgow had 198 urinals. Notably, 80 to 90% of the population did not reside in slums, and many working-class families, especially in the later Victorian period, did not live in overcrowded conditions. And what seriously needs reassessing is the assumption of dirt. By contemporary standards, slum dwellers were not all very dirty, or at least they didn't choose to be. Evidence lurks in depictions of some slum life. Gustave Doré's famous etching on page 50, which we've seen here. That one. Shows lines of washing hanging in tenement backyards. Some even served as laundries for the well-to-do, those most offended by the slum's dirty existence. Number 4. When crime paid. Newspapers made a mint out of exaggerating the threat posed by the criminal class. Though the Victorian age has come to be remembered as criminal and violent, most of the best-known vicious anti-heroes of the 19th century are fictional or semi-fictional. For example, Fagin and Jack the Ripper. Our perceptions have been largely driven by the Victorians' own fears and claims of a large, hardened, uncivilised and largely irretrievable criminal class in towns and cities. The famous early Victorian social investigators, Henry Mayhew and John Binney, boasted that they had managed to assemble 150 of these creatures in a room. The effect, a spectacle of squalor, rags and wretchedness. Some were young men and some were children. Many had the deep sunken, half-averted eye, so characteristic of natural dishonesty and cunning. The hair of most of the lads was cut very close to the head, showing their recent liberation from prison. The popularisation of phrenology, a pseudoscience primarily focused on measurements of the human skull, gave the idea of the criminal class a scientific authority. The arrival of crime statistics in 1857 brought accurate estimates of the dimensions of this class, 20,000 members in London alone, according to journalist James Greenwood in 1869, and the introduction of criminal registers with photographs enabled the monitoring of every individual. Contemporary fears about crime and violence were further inflamed by an expanding and increasingly pictorial newspaper press. Crime news was readily available and sold well. Detailed coverage of a particularly gruesome murder could increase circulation several-fold. against every level of society. At the same time, society was becoming less violent. Male-on-male violence almost certainly declined as displays of aggression were increasingly regarded as unacceptable. But that didn't stop many Victorians believing they were living through a crime-ravaged age. As one committed working-class newspaper reader declared to Henry Mayhew, "I read Lloyd's weekly newspaper on a Sunday, and what murders and robberies there is now." Perceptions are important in assessments of quality of life, but so too is lived experience. Victorians were predominantly spectators rather than victims of crime, and spectating, when violence was presented in neatly packaged, entertaining forms, could be an enjoyable pastime. So this is a copy of the police news showing details of the Whitechapel murders. So this is the front page from 22nd of September 1888. Okay, and finally, number 5, a nation rises from its sickbed. And we've got an illustration. This is a cartoon from 1849. It plays on the link between cholera and contaminated water, posited by John Snow, a breakthrough that saved many lives. Scientists took the fight to killer diseases with impressive results. The Victorians, especially poor ones, were at high risk of catching some nasty diseases. Most of the common killers, measles, scarlet fever, smallpox and typhus, had blighted Britain for centuries, yet overcrowded and unsanitary conditions created by rapid urbanisation did assist the spread of these infectious diseases, as well as various illnesses of the digestive system such as diarrhoea and gastroenteritis. What's more, life expectancy, which had previously shown long-term improvement, took a tumble in the second quarter of the 19th century. By the start of Queen Victoria's reign, it had fallen to around 25 to 27 years in the industrial towns of Manchester, Liverpool and Glasgow. of